The underdogs lead the pack. Kotler's crew owns the women's leaderboard at the West Coast Classic. Cole is captain consistency, and there's a lot of green going around for the teams. There was an epic comeback at the Atlas Games, and the Russians rule in Asia. That's next on this edition of Game Central. Hi everybody, welcome to another edition of Game Central. I'm Sean Woodland. The fourth and final week of semifinal competition is behind us, and we are here to run down all the qualifiers who will be heading to the 2021 No Bull CrossFit Games. And let's start with the one competition that was held in person. That's the West Coast Classic. It was held at the Orleans Arena in Las Vegas, Nevada. 5 men, 5 women, and 5 teams advancing to the CrossFit Games. And for the individuals, all of the qualifiers are veterans. Cole Sager wins for the men. Bethany Shadburne, Kari Pearce, and Danielle Brandon are your top 3 for the women. And then 2 Invictus teams qualify for the CrossFit Games. And speaking of the top 3 for the women, Bethany Shadburne, Kari Pearce, and Danielle Brandon were inside the top 5 in the overall standings the entire time. Shadburne and Pearce were the only 2 athletes who scored more than 600 points. They each had at least 1 event win, and between all 3 of them, they only had 3 event finishes outside of the top 7. On the men's side, Cole Sager was the picture of consistency for nearly the entire weekend. He had 2 event wins and only finished outside the top 5 once. That was the final event where he took a 20th, and he had already all but wrapped up his 7th straight trip to the CrossFit Games by that point. Sager won with a total of 583 points. He beat second place Noah Olson by 35. And on the team side, as I mentioned, a pair of Invictus squads finished first and second on the overall leaderboard. Invictus, they win with 603 points, the only team to get above the 600 point mark. They did not have an event win, but they only finished outside the top 5 once. Invictus Unconquerable, meanwhile, they took second with 595 points, just 8 back of Invictus. They had 3 event wins, and they also had just 1 finish outside of the top 5. The Atlas Games, that was one of 2 virtual semifinals that were held this weekend. And for the men, there was a pretty impressive comeback that was pulled off by the professor, Brent Fikowski. But first, let's take a look at the qualifiers for the men, the women, and the teams. 5 spots as well on the line here for the individuals and the teams. Pat Vellner pretty much goes wire to wire to take the top spot there. All veterans on the men's side. Carolyne Prevost wins for the women, but there are 2 rookies who will be making their first appearances at the games for them, Bailey Rail and Sydney McCallishan. And then for the teams, Pro1 Montreal was dominant. Mentioned Brent Fikowski. He put himself in a hole after day 1. He was 15th overall after 2 events, and then the comeback was on. Fikowski cracked the top 10 at the end of day 2. He was in 7th thanks to a win in event 4. He then got to 5th overall after yet another event win and held on to that spot with a 4th place finish in the 6th and final event. Fikowski is making his 6th straight trip to the CrossFit Games. Pat Vellner did not need the same kind of heroics as Brent Fikowski. Vellner took the overall lead after the 2nd event, and he is heading back to the CrossFit Games for the 6th time as an individual.
Pat, a thoroughly dominating performance here at the Atlas Games virtual semifinal. He pretty much led almost wire to wire. No results outside of the top 8. So how are you feeling right now, less than a month ago to the games, with where you're at both physically and mentally?
I think it's a good sign. That's about all you can hope for. We had a pretty strong and a pretty deep men's field, so to be successful that way in that competition, I think is a good indicator. But the things you have to do to be successful in an online competition are a little different than the things you have to do to be successful at the CrossFit Games. So things are going to change in the next month, and it's a pretty tight turnaround. So I'm trying to take advantage of maybe a handful of days off before I really get back into it again.
Vellner's competition started with a 7th place in the opening event. Then he rattled off back-to-back victories in events 2 and 3. He would finish inside the top 3 in 2 of the 3 final events. Vellner would wound up unofficially with a score of 544 points to take the overall victory. He was the only man at the Atlas Games to score more than 500 points. While Vellner held steady at the top of the overall leaderboard, Carolyne Prevost, she was all over the place throughout the weekend. She won the first 2 events, but then she started to slide down the leaderboard, and with 1 event to go, she had fallen outside of the top 5. Prevost was 6th overall heading into the final event. she would win that final event and wind up right where she started, in first place. Prevost wound up edging out Mackenzie Riley for first place overall by just 1 point. Finally, for the teams, Pro1 Montreal wins the Atlas Games, and they return to the CrossFit Games after finishing 9th there in 2019. And for one of their team members, it's their very first appearance in Madison.
We followed our game plan. Basically, we practiced it by 5 rounds and taking a little break while the other one was doing 5 rounds. I think we were a little bit faster when we practiced it because we wanted to go dig deep and to feel the pain that we would be feeling, and it paid off. So yeah, we followed what we had to do, and it was nice. Again, another nice workout. I'm really proud for him because it's going to be his first time. It's his first time.
Pro1 led wire to wire, and they turned in a dominant performance over the 6 events. They won 4 of those 6 events. Their worst finish was 6th, and their other finish was a 2nd place. They wound up with 570 points out of a possible 600. The CrossFit Asia Invitational was the 3rd and final semifinal event held this past weekend. That was also virtual. 2 men, 2 women, and 2 teams advancing to the 2021 Noble CrossFit Games, and it was a good weekend for the Russians. For the men, Stas Solodov edges out Alexander Elin. They are your top 2. Svetlana Kubyshkina finishes just ahead of Sungyoung Choi, and then Kolesnikov and Dubai, they were 1st and 2nd for the entire competition. Stas Solodov, well, he decided that 1 ticket to the CrossFit Games just wasn't enough, so he went out and earned a 2nd. He had already qualified to compete in Madison in the 35 to 39-year-old Masters division. Solodov never finished lower than 7th. He won the final event to hang on to the top spot on the overall leaderboard. He also had 3 second-place finishes over the weekend. A Russian sat atop the overall leaderboard for the women when it was all said and done as well. Svetlana Kubyshkina got herself into first place after winning event 3. It was her 2nd event win in 3 events. She then closed with 3 straight finishes of 7th or better to wind up with a total of 544 points. She is making her first trip to the CrossFit Games. And the Kolesnikov team completed the Russian sweep on top of the overall standings for the 3 divisions. They were impressive in doing so. They won 3 of the 6 events. They took 2nd in the 3 they didn't win, and their times and scores were pretty competitive when compared with teams from other virtual semifinal competitions, and they are making their first trip to the CrossFit Games. There is just one more stop before we get to Madison and the 2021 Noble CrossFit Games. That is the Last-Chance Online Qualifier. That takes place on July 3rd and 4th. The workouts for that competition will be released on Monday, June 28th, and we will have a full breakdown of those coming up next week. Also, if you want to be in Madison in person to watch the CrossFit Games, it is not too late. Tickets for the games are still on sale, and you can also register to volunteer. Head to games.crossfit.com for more information on that. That is it for this edition of Games Central. I'm Sean Woodland. Thank you so much for watching, everybody.